Weaver, I want to say thank you for being a part of our conversation today. We have this YouTube channel that we love that's called Own the Journey. And our mission is to share wisdom and great knowledge from great leaders like yourself with others around the world to help them to solve the problems that maybe you figured out or that you've mostly figured out so that they can accelerate their organizations. And we just know that from hearing and learning about your experiences that you've got some awesome things to share. You've got an interesting story that I can't wait to hear about. So you actually you described yourself as a recovering attorney.
Yes, I'm a recovering lawyer.
Yeah,
that's true.
Lawyer. Yeah, so my dad is a lawyer, so that
a real one.
Yeah. Well, yeah, he didn't just play one on TV. He just retired a few years ago and still practices some, but he stays very busy. But it's an interesting dynamic to go from being a lawyer into an environment where you're creating medical devices to change people's lives. So tell us a little bit about
how that happened.
And how that happened.
So much of my life has, I think the best analogy would be a pinball. So it hits something and it ricochets off and hits something else. Yeah. So when I was getting ready to graduate from undergraduate school, the Vietnam War was just getting heated up. This 1965, and I was on the debate team. I was on the national debate team at Dartmouth, and everybody's worried about their student deferment. But I'm in the ROTC. I'm going to be commissioned. I'm going to go in the Army. I mean, I don't know deferment around.
Yeah.
And people kept saying, well, so where are you going to go to graduate school? And I kept saying, graduate school? I have to go to graduate school? Everybody on the debate team was going to law school.
Yeah.
So I thought, sure, why not? So I applied to law schools. And as it happened, I was deferred from going on to active duty because I was in law school.
Oh, wow.
So I missed all the fun in 65 and 66 and 67. I graduated in 1968, which was when TET was. That was the big eye-opening experience in Vietnam. So I got into the University of Virginia, got into Columbia and a couple of others, and Virginia gave me a full scholarship plus extra money, which was relevant.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So after I graduated from law school, I went on active duty, and I served in Berlin, where I was a rifle company commander in the Berlin Brigade, and then the Army basically did this. Here's a guy who's going to be in for 2 years, and he's in Germany. He really should be in Vietnam. So they said, leave immediately, go to Vietnam. So I did. When I got to Vietnam, although I was a company commander and a captain by that time, they were desperately short of lawyers. So I ended up being a lawyer in Vietnam. Yeah, I was a non-JAG lawyer. So JAG stood for Judge Advocate General. And they all had to sign up for 4 years. I'd signed up for 2 years, and I was just as much out of combat as they were, and it used to annoy the hell out of them, right? So I got out of the Army, and I went to work for a Wall Street law firm, which is where I'd done a summer job. I went to work for a Wall Street law firm and learned the practice of law from them.
Yeah.
But I didn't much like the practice of law in a law partnership.
Okay.
It was all right. We were working on big deals and well compensated, nice status and all that sort of stuff. I left there to go to work for the mutual of the INA Corporation in Philadelphia, where I was recruited by a guy who'd been my boss in Germany.
Wow.
But I was there for a while, and then I moved to a privately owned industrial products manufacturing company called Indian Head. It was owned by one man, a multi-billionaire, of course, and his name was Thyssen Bornemisza. He was from the German Thyssen family, like war criminals of World War II, except he'd been from the Dutch branch of the family and had escaped war crimes trials and so forth. And
wow.
Headquarters was in Monaco, and there was a U.S. company and a European company. So I got to go back and forth to Monaco a lot, and I liked it. But the problem was, I finally decided it was being a lawyer that I didn't really want to do.
Okay.
Why not? So it would be like, the analogy would be, if you're a boxer, you're either in the ring, boxing,
Mm-hmm.
or you're in the corner, putting the smelling salts under their name, putting astringent on the cuts.
Yeah.
And I got to thinking, geez, when things go well, everybody rewards the businessman who was involved, and he pats you on the back, so I couldn't have done it without the law department. When things go badly, however, it's almost always the law department that was the reason why they'd gone badly. And I thought, well, why don't I try actually doing it instead of advising people about it? So I became the head of mergers and acquisitions for that company. And then I was recruited away to the Mutual of New York by another guy who had been in the Army with me to come in and be their general counsel. And I said I would only do that if they would give me a line position as well.
Wow.
So they did. The law department was 200 people. It wasn't a small operation.
Yeah, big deal.
And it would have been bigger if it were a property and casualty company. It was a life insurance company, so it didn't have that many lawsuits. And there was a internecine fight for who was going to be the next president. So I was an executive vice president. The other guy was an executive vice president. He got the job. And as it happened, he and I didn't like each other. Actually, that's a mild statement of how we felt about each other. But once he was the designated new president, it was clear to me that the only difference between him and me under these circumstances, Tom, would have been I'd have fired him instantly, and he would have preferred to keep me around to pull the wings off of the fly kind of thing. So I joined the Bush-Quayle re-election campaign in Washington, D.C. This is 1992. George H.W. Bush was one of the finest men I ever met. Can't say that I knew him well, but I knew him well enough to know something about him.
Yeah.
And the campaign itself was eye-opening. The fact then was Washington was a snake pit then, and can only imagine that it's worse now.
I would agree.
And it was especially the case that if the executive branch was in a different party than the legislative branch, people in the executive branch were going to pay a high price because the politicians would call you and rake you over the coals.
Mm-hmm.
But Bush didn't get reelected, so this never became an issue, right?
Right.
So I came down to Florida. I had a weekend place here in Gainesville. I'd married a girl from Gainesville, well, a woman. She wasn't a girl, but
Yeah.
You got to be careful these days.
Yeah. You do.
And I'm thinking, what am I going to do? The job of general counsel of the Aetna opens up. And it was Zoe Baird, a woman named Zoe Baird, was nominated to be attorney general, and that job was going to be available as general counsel. They said, you're the ideal person for this job. And I'm thinking, I don't see how I can turn it down. It's $500,000 a year. On the other hand, it's back up in the Northeast. It's in Hartford, Connecticut. This isn't death, but it's, border line. And for all I know, there's another guy just like the guy who just became president of the Mutual of New York who's there waiting to be president. I'm going to hate him too.
Right.
And a friend of mine said, why don't we start a biotech company? I said,
And what year was this?
this is 93.
93. Okay.
And I said, geez, I don't know the first thing about biotech. Oh, you don't have to. My brother, the research scientist, he knows all there is to know. That was the first mistake I made. Okay, so if this is wisdom, if I'm going to impart wisdom,
Yeah, that's it.
I was able to make every mistake you could possibly make in starting up a life sciences company, although there were some mistakes I couldn't make because a prior mistake had sort of foreclosed the opportunity to make the later mistake, right? So, and one of them was you actually did have to know about biotechnology to be a good CEO of a biotech
I'm sure.
company. So, to go back to the pinball analogy, it's my 35th law school reunion, and I'm going to go up to Virginia. And there's some good friends that are there. And I'm going to say, I'm looking for a job. And they're going to say, we'll look for you. We'll keep our eyes out. There are a couple of people there who are going to say, poor Gaines, look at him, his age, no job. What a pathetic thing. And I just didn't have the moral courage to face that group of people. So on the drive down to the Orlando airport, there is a rest stop called Oka Humpka. And it had in it at that time a machine where for $5 you could get 20 business cards printed up. So I printed up business cards for this company that I had founded, that I made myself the chairman, president, and the CEO. And then I thought, okay, now when they say, what are you doing? I'm not going to say I'm looking for a job to these guys. I'm going to say, I'm president and chairman of a biotech company. And I got up to Virginia, and all these people who were good friends said, oh my God, if I could just get out of the practice of law. I got to bill 2,000 hours a year. I never see my family, and I'm not sure how, from one day to the next, how I'm going to do with dividing up the pie. I can't quit. I got alimony, and I got child support, and I got this big mortgage, but you have found the way out. And I thought, maybe I ought to give it a shot.
Yeah.
So that first company was trying to do two things. One was it had a technology for making insulin-producing islets out of adult stem cells.
Okay.
Nobody even thought there were adult stem cells. That was one of the mistakes. Don't do things too early. That was too early. And the other was it had a probiotic. It was a bacterium called Oxalobacter formigenes that broke down oxalate. The oxalate was the reason why people get calcium oxalate kidney stones, which is what most of them are. So here was another lesson. Do not put two technologies that are different from each other in the same company. It's worth half as much as the two separately. And the reason for that is that the people who understood the whole idea of cell culture and we're going to make islets that are going to produce insulin wouldn't know the first thing about a probiotic. And the people who knew about bacteriology wouldn't know the first thing about the islet.
So ultimately, there's no synergy. There's no complementary.
As far as the investors were concerned, when they said to me, well, I just don't know about that. And we said, well, okay, we'll split the company, we'll change it in. And they said, no, we want it. We just don't know about it. And we're not going to give you any value for it, which is why I said it was worth half as much together. That company lasted, it eventually was sold to a Swedish company, but just the probiotic part and the islet producing part really, after 8 years, we said we could make the islets, we could make them in commercial quantities. And we said it'll take another 5 years and maybe 20 million more to find out if we can actually make them, because growing mammalian cells turns out to be complicated and expensive.
Yeah.
So we folded that part out and sold the other part.
So I heard two little other nuggets that you just threw out there. One was know your target investor, and the other is know your target customer. So you on both sides of the business.
I was completely ignorant in every respect of both of those.
Yeah, I have been there. I've sold the wrong things to the wrong person more than once in my career.
Well, in our case, we were unable to sell the wrong things. So we got investment on them. As I said, the Swedes bought the probiotic. But here was another thing. In 20 years from the start, they were finally running the phase 3 pivotal trial. So from bench to launch, it was close to 20 years.
That's hard.
If you're using investor dollars, this was one guy. The only honest-to-God card-carrying multimillionaire I ever knew who was a communist. And I mean, he was a member of the Communist Party. He had a condo in Paris. He had a condo in Stockholm. He had his regular quarters in Uppsala, Sweden. He was a multimillionaire, and he was a member of the Communist Party, just for what it's worth.
Yeah. So when you
if it's a single individual, you're not diluting the investors because it's his money,
Yeah.
And he had all he needed and more.
Yeah. Well, when you talk about ping-ponging, You didn't just ping pong.
Pinballing.
Pinball, yeah, pinball, yeah. They're
Ping pong goes back and forth, pinballs.
all over the place. Yeah, all. But that, I mean, you're talking about political things too. I mean, dealing with political parties here and having to deal with that had to be challenging in its own way.
It was.
Yeah.
But what actually moved me to do this, I told you I went up to the law school reunion.
Yeah.
And all these people said, wow, what a great thing. You found your way out of the practice of law. But I was thinking to myself, this may sound Pollyanna-ish, Tom. Comes the end of the day, you're on your deathbed, and they said, so what did you do with your life? And you say, well, I made a lot of money. And I thought, that doesn't seem that satisfying to me.
Yeah.
If I could say I tried to cure type 1 diabetes, it almost doesn't matter if you could cure it. You tried it.
Yeah.
You were willing to devote yourself to that.
Mm-hmm.
And that probably pushed me over the edge to not go back into the law or the financial world.
Yeah.
Where I went.
I love that. The mission, way more important. The outcome.
Well, the idea that, so what gives a person's life meaning, Tom? What would you answer to that? What gives a life a meaning?
I think it's that you make a difference in others. You make a difference for other people. I mean,
You have a responsibility that you feel you're going to carry out to take
sir.
care of somebody else.
yes, sir.
Yeah, I think so too.
I do too.
Do you ask a Russian oligarch what gives his life meaning? God knows what the answer would be, right? No.
Right.
So that company was named Ixion. There's another mistake. So I'm looking up for names of companies, and I thought, well, science company, and you get a lot of science names out of Greece, and so there's a Greek god named Ixion, and he was condemned by Zeus to be bound to a burning wheel for eternity, and I thought, well, and kidney stones, they hurt, and bound to a burning wheel. How good is this? Nobody had the name. It had a big X in it, like the unknown factor in science, and so we named the company Ixion. After it had been running for a couple of years, I finally had an assistant who was a historian by trade, and I said, by the way, I'd like to know more about this guy Ixion. That was how you pronounce it, but nobody ever pronounced it that way, so we pronounced it Ixion. Tell me about him. Well, you know why he was condemned by Zeus?
I know.
Because he attempted to rape Hera. That's why. We named the company after an attempted rapist. You want to change the name? No, I don't want to change the name. I'm just hoping nobody else
No.
knows or looks it up.
Yeah.
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 So when that company was over, I joined the board of directors as chairman of the board and, by the way, general counsel of a local contract manufacturing and development company, CDMO, called at that time Nanotherapeutics. It was an odd name for a company since it didn't do any nanotechnology and it wasn't a therapeutic company. But otherwise, Nanotherapeutics was the perfect name
Right.
for the company. And it won a really big contract from the DOD to build a medical countermeasures plant up in Alachua, 15 miles from here. And so this was a company that had maybe 40 employees, a revenue stream of $12 million a year, and it's a $300 million contract.
Wow.
So it was like the dog that caught the bus, right? And so we catch the bus, and we're building the building. And in order to build the building, we had to borrow money from a special situations lender. So you know what a special situations lender is?
Well, I can assume from
Yeah, it's one that if you can't get money from
anybody else.
anybody else and you don't want to go to the mob, all right? So this is the group in between. They tend to be more like the mob than like
Traditional lender.
J.P. Morgan or somebody like that. And we were in trouble with them, and we were in trouble with the government because we weren't meeting the building schedule, and the guy who was the CEO was not making sound judgments, and so although he owned 40% of the company, the board said he had to go.
Oh, that's tough.
It was tough. He has survived. He's a genius. But running a big company wasn't part of his genius, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So he was let go. And thereafter, there was a another one of these contests between me and the guy who was the EVP for finance.
Oh no.
Yeah, and he eventually goes to the deposed CEO, and they turn out the turf out the independent board and take back over, and the old guy comes back in, but then he gets bought out. So that was part of their deal. Then there I am again, and I get sued by the company.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it was the best thing that ever happened to me, in many ways, because they ended up settling the lawsuit by paying the defendants to go away. This is a good deal if you can get it here.
Yeah, I'm scratching my head a little bit, so help me understand.
Well, the lawsuit was a really bad lawsuit, and it claimed fraud, asserted fraud. Well, you can't, in our legal system, I can't just say, okay, Tom, I'm suing you for fraud. I have to show what did you do to defraud anybody, and they weren't going to be able to show that. I mean, they couldn't even manufacture showing it. It hadn't happened that way. And the other people who were the independent directors also sued for fraud, included the former Surgeon General of the Army. I mean, oh my gosh. I mean, it's an A-list board, right?
Right.
So eventually they came and said, all right, I think we ought to settle this lawsuit. That was after they had failed to read that part of the bylaws that said you have to advance the defense costs to somebody who's being sued because they were a director. So it's now costing them hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they're going to lose. And so they said, let's settle. What did you have in mind? Well, how about we'll sign releases and we'll walk away. And we said, no, you can't accuse us of fraud and just walk away. You're going to have to pay something.
Yeah.
So they did. Unfortunately, I can't tell you how much.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah.
Forget. Well,
because the settlement agreement says I can't. But that's how it got settled, by the payment of money from them. I'm sure it was covered by their D&O insurance.
I'm sure it was. But at the same time, I think you probably learned a really valuable lesson in business governance and understanding bylaws as a board member to make sure that you've got your ass covered if you're taking on those responsibilities.
There are two forms of, so this was a Delaware company. I'm a Delaware company. I know Delaware law. That's one of the things that I learned in the law firm. Delaware has the possibility that your bylaws can be permissive. The company may advance legal expenses, or mandatory. The company shall advance legal expenses.
Wow.
If you have the first kind of bylaw and the board of the company chooses not to advance your expenses, it's up to you now.
Yeah.
If you have the second, the mandatory kind, they must advance the expenses, and if they don't, you sue them in Delaware and you win. Yeah. Delaware does not like it if a company tries to avoid that obligation in its bylaws. So take this lesson home.
Yeah.
Look at the bylaws and make sure they're mandatory coverage if you want to protect your directors and officers against the possibility of a lawsuit, not just by the outside world, but by the company itself.
Yeah.
Now, you have to give the money back if it's determined ultimately that you weren't entitled to indemnity.
Yeah.
But if the case gets settled,
you get your
you don't have to give it back.
Yeah.
Or part of the settlement agreement anyway.
Yeah, that's some wisdom right there.
So there were a couple of other false starts when one of them just was a technology that was never going to fly. And it takes you a couple of months to work out whether or not.
Well, that was one of the things that I wanted to learn from you is how do you determine? I mean, I'm sure there's 100 ideas and maybe 10 of them have a possibility of actually going somewhere. And how do you determine? Yeah.
Well, I bet if you ask 10 people, you get 10 answers.
Yeah. But you've done it, so.
I've now done it enough times to know where I'm familiar with the concept that if you put your thumb on an anvil and hit it with a hammer, it will hurt. So the first thing you need to know, oddly enough, is there a proprietary interest? Is there something protectable about the idea? Mm-hmm. So if the idea was, I'm going to take your blue shirt and turn it into a red shirt, well, if it turns out that's a major market maker. Everybody with dye that can turn blue shirts into red shirts, so they're not protectable.
Yeah.
And then the next thing you need to know is, well, would anybody want it? If you had it, if you got it, would somebody want it?
For it.
Yeah. Well, that's the second question. Do they want it? If they want it, how much are they willing to pay for it? So if you ask a potential customer, well, would you like an iPhone that does everything iPhone does, and twice as much and half the size? Sure, that's $800. Well, okay, let me think about it. I'll get by with my iPhone SE.
Right.
So do they want it? If they don't want it, you're not going to sell it. If they want it, will they pay for it? And there, you really are guessing. You have no idea.
So you test the market.
Till you know what you can make it for.
Yeah.
Forget,
I'm with you.
how much you're going to be able to, what's it going to cost to make one? What kind of margin do you want on that? That's going to give you your price to the user. Now will they pay for it? You don't know the answer to that. You don't know the answer to any of these things.
Wow. Makes it tough.
It's sailing off the edge of the map, is what it amounts to.
And shit.
Yeah, so it's terra incognito. Past that, or incognita.
Good diet. I'm with you though.
Yeah.
It's me.
Yeah. So then you want to know, well, is it protected enough? Is it something that somebody would want? Do you think they'll pay for it in some reasonable price range? So you're looking out there and it's COVID time and people are buying Peloton bikes and they're paying $2,500 for a bike. So you think, well, okay, if you have a product that might actually help with somebody who's got a condition like post-traumatic stress disorder, and they're willing to pay $2,500 for a bike, you can probably sell them this thing and some number less than that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what we decided we could probably sell it, that there would be people who would want it. Why did we think they would want it? Well, it turns out that post-traumatic stress disorder is a really, really, really debilitating condition.
It is.
And it essentially is the case that you never feel safe. If you've got PTSD, you just don't feel safe. And the reason for that is you've been exposed to a trauma. The trauma, we now believe, actually has physically altered neuronal patterns in the brain. And the effect of that is your parasympathetic nervous system, which is the one that says, calm down, Tom, everything is going to be okay, is dysfunctional. And you're permanently in a state of alert, hypervigilant. So you and I, assuming you don't have PTSD, you and I hear a car backfire, we think it's a car backfiring. A guy with PTSD thinks it's a gunshot.
Right.
We drive down a dirt road, we're not worried that there's an IED buried on the side of the road. Guys come back from Iraq or Afghanistan, some of them can't drive on a dirt road. It just makes them too nervous, too upset. So this particular technology had a patent that had been filed by the University of Florida, and it had 3 inventors who had actually tested the product on people with PTSD, and it made them better.
Wow.
So now you had sort of the package. Nobody had one of. There was some protection in the intellectual property. Looked like people who needed it would pay for it, and it worked. Okay, so that means, in essence, that's when you get to green light it. So if you were thinking of this like a movie, you go and you pitch the movie to whoever is the head of the studio, right? And you tell them how they're going to make money on this movie. And the fact is, they don't know.
Right.
Nobody knows. But if you tell a good enough story, you'll get a green light. And you get to go through the development process. Right. So that's what we did. And
awesome.
That's how I think you go about picking a medical device product. Even though the fact is, I have never, ever seen a small company sue somebody under their intellectual property protection.
I haven't either.
It's too expensive, and the first thing somebody says back is, well, you don't have a good patent. And, you're better off saying it's patented than suing anybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So talk to us about that experience going through the patent process. I mean, I know that there's a lot of entrepreneurs that are paying attention to what we're doing that think they want a patent. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But I mean, I know from our own experiences that it's a little tedious and laborious. Talk to us about it from your world in terms of a medical device and what it means to actually go through that.
So if you're going to license your technology out of a university, the chances are high that they've decided to pursue a patent. And then when you license it from them, you're going to reimburse them for the patent expenses. In this case, they had been prosecuting the patent. Well, they had not been awarded any claims yet, so it's even more unknown than before. And it costs to do a utility patent. So basically 2 kinds of patents. There are design patents and utility patents, composition of matter patents generally, and not relevant here. Design patents are fairly inexpensive, but a typical utility patent costs you in the $20,000 to $30,000 range to prosecute if you just do it domestically. And if you're going to do it internationally, each patent family will run you $100,000 or more.
Wow.
And one of the problems with university patents that you have to be aware of and watch out for is the university is measured on how many patents it gets, but not on whether the patent's useful. And commercial patents typically are designed to support a particular product that makes them useful. So after we licensed this patent, we actually filed a couple of additional patent applications to cover the things that the university patent didn't think of, and also to expand it to the international field. Yeah, so even though nobody ever has sued on a patent, you won't make it past the first screen of an institutional investor if it's not proprietary.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're stuck with one. And in many cases, it's helpful that if you have a patent estate and it sort of surrounds your product, it will keep people away.
It will.
They also know they don't want to litigate this.
Right.
And so the likelihood that you'll actually be able to use it as a sword is not as useful as the fact that it may cause other people to say, well, we don't need to go very far down that road because they've got intellectual property.
Sounds like more than anything, it's as much the foundation of the house as anything. Like, I mean, you kind of have to have it at the base.
Have one, because otherwise the house falls down. But you're not going to do much with it after it's
there. Yeah. Well, I first want to applaud you because I know that in the veteran community, PTSD and beyond, but specifically in the veteran community, the number of suicides, the number of people that are impacted by this is
it's like 20 a day.
It's unbelievable. And you're a veteran. I'm a veteran.
You are.
I was in the Navy for 4 years.
Squid.
Yeah, squid. That's right. Yeah. So I got to travel around and float around and do some fun stuff and see some things. But
you did sea duty? Did you?
I did. Yeah.
In the Med?
In the Med. I was on a destroyer, the USS Arthur W. Radford, so DD-968.
So one of my law school classmates, one of my undergraduate classmates was an ensign on Springfield when she was the flagship of the Med Fleet. And while I'm in Vietnam, batting off cockroaches that were the size of ravens, he's going to Malta, Villefranche, and
and mine was closer to that. I have to admit, I never had the hard day. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you're still a vet. Okay.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to serve and see some amazing things and meet some amazing people. And more than anything, what I learned from all of that is how fortunate we are in the United States. I mean, people, you think you know until you see things that you never see here.
Or I was going through the airport in Phoenix, and I had a long time between planes, and there was a shoe shine guy there. And it turns out he was from Somalia, where he slept on a bed with his 8 siblings. And there wasn't always enough to eat. And he said to me, you Americans have got no idea how lucky you are.
And he's right.
So you just don't have any idea. And it's true. I mean, I didn't see a lot of poverty in Germany when I was stationed there, not in Berlin for sure. But in Vietnam, you saw people who the death of the water buffalo meant some of the members of the family weren't going to make it till next year.
Wow.
You know, because it's that close to subsistence.
Yeah.
You know, we don't treasure what we have.
And I think we can all learn something from that. I was able to stand watch with a gentleman in Romania, and I asked him if he ever thought about leaving, and he shared with me that he would love to come to America, like that was his ultimate dream, but he was the only income in their family, and it was him and his wife and their 2 kids, and her parents and his parents, and they all lived in a 1-room home. And he was the only one with income, and the price of a ticket to come to the United States was his entire year's salary. So he was like, it's literally impossible for me to go. It's too much. So,
and here we are. So the Poles have let in, I think, over 2 million refugees from Ukraine. There are now 5 million refugees at population of 43 million.
right.
And we said we'd let in 100,000. Well, hell. Really? Can't we do better than that?
That
Yeah.
we can.
Anyway, so
Before you move, I wanted to commend you because from the veteran side, I have friends that suffer from PTSD, and I appreciate your mission, what you're doing. And it is real.
it is. And oddly enough, it's not the biggest group of people with PTSD. There are more first responders in terms of numbers,
Yes,
ICU nurses,
I can imagine.
emergency department personnel. Women, 1 in 9 women in the course of their life will have PTSD.
Really?
Women they're more subject to sexual abuse. Penetrative rape results in PTSD 100% of the time. Most of the time you're exposed to a trauma, most people get well, not rape. And they're often abused as children. They frequently are the ones that lose a loved one early, you know, that they survive their husband or whatever it is. Yeah, much bigger population, much harder to identify and get to.
Yeah.
So we're going to start, and I think the country owes something to its vets. So we're going to start with the veteran population because we know how to reach them.
Right.
My dad was a World War II glider infantryman. And he and his cohort never talked about the war except the funny things that had happened. So he was a professional soldier, and whenever there'd be a party, the men would all get off at one end and the women would go off in another, and the boys would all gather around the guys, and then they'd tell war stories, right?
Right.
But they never talked about war. Right. They talked about, yeah.
I know what you mean.
And I think, in retrospect, he probably had PTSD. Glider infantry was it was dangerous when nobody was trying to kill you. I mean, except for the glider, it tried to kill you.
Yeah, right.
And then he was in Korea, and then he was in Vietnam. I mean, he was a professional soldier. Right. But that generation was just told, go home, pull your socks up, get back to work, you know?
Right.
And so they may have had outbursts of anger that they didn't really understand where it came from, or they were depressed. Alcoholism. My dad wasn't an alcoholic, but he had those other 2 things, and I don't think he ever confronted the fact that he might have been able to get better.
Yeah.
That was just the way life was.
Yeah.
You know.
Just suck it up.
Yeah. Just suck it up. Go back to work. He died at 62.
Wow. Really young.
Yeah. Well, PTSD extracts a really big metabolic penalty if it's untreated, if it's unsuccessfully treated.
So talk to us about the device itself.
Okay.
So I don't understand how the device can have an impact
Right.
Intrigued.
So Josh and I were talking about this at lunch, about how do we get across just what this device does in a way that doesn't require us to explain anatomy. And we decided we couldn't think of a way. We just say, got PTSD, that's bad. Put this in your ear, you'll feel better. That's good, right? And then we've explained it, right? So the reason why people with PTSD have the problem that they have, as I said when we started, is that the part of the autonomic nervous system that tells them to calm down and that things are safe is not functioning right.
Right.
So they never calm down. And the result of not calming down is excess cortisol, excess adrenaline, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up. And if you do that for years, bad things will happen.
Yeah.
Right. The vagus nerve, which is the 10th cranial nerve, is the longest nerve in the body, controls a lot of things: heart rate, digestion, respiration, controls a lot of things. And it is indistinguishable from the parasympathetic nervous system, so that if you stimulate the vagus nerve, you invoke the parasympathetic nervous system that tells you you're safe.
Okay.
So why it works is because we can reach the vagus nerve easily through the ear. It's very close to the skin here.
Mm-hmm.
Is we can give it a tiny little electrical charge, a pulse.
Mm-hmm.
It causes the parasympathetic nervous system to increase its tone. It's called parasympathetic tone. Increases the parasympathetic tone. And then you calm down. And when you calm down, all this other good stuff happens to you. You can go to sleep. You're not anxious. You're not depressed. Not everybody gets better all the time.
Sure.
In every way. It's human beings. But we, and in our pilot trial, we got a 90% responder rate.
Wow.
And they all got better. And they got better to the extent that they didn't want to give the device back at the end of the trial. And it was a clumsy device. It set their fanny pack, and it was 2 ear clips. I mean, they didn't want to give it back. And they'd gotten better. And we gave them a quality of life survey at the beginning for baseline. And then after 2 months, they were a lot better.
Wow.
And the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, they were a lot better. The average person doesn't care what his score is. They just want to know that they are better.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't want to give it back because they wanted to be sure it was there if they needed it. If they wanted it. If they wanted to go to a grocery store. I don't know why grocery stores are a problem, but it's a problem for people. Maybe it's the crowd.
Yeah.
That's how it works and why it works. But I think from the average individual who uses it, they just want to put it on and see if they get better.
Yeah.
And they do.
Making a difference.
Yeah. So there are other ways of treating PTSD. There's various forms of cognitive behavioral therapy, mostly in the form of what they call prolonged exposure. So the way prolonged exposure works is this. What's the worst day of your life ever? So come in and let's talk about it over and over and over again until it doesn't bother you anymore.
Because you've beat it up, essentially. You've talked it out. It's over.
What you do is you talk it out, and it's clear nothing bad is happening to you. And after a while, the sense that you're in danger all of the time because of this leftover fear memory will diminish. Well, the problem is half of the people won't do it at all. They can't. If you watch an interview with somebody, we watched an interview with a sniper. So he was taking the interview that would allow you to measure whether or not you have PTSD. And he'd shot a child in Iraq. And the way he told the story was he's there, his spotter says there's somebody coming, looks like they're carrying an explosive, and they're coming toward our position. Looks at him through the scope, and it's a kid. And he says to the spotter, it's a child. The spotter says, yeah, but he's carrying an explosive. And then the spotter says, take the shot. So he shoots the kid.
Oh my gosh.
He was carrying an explosive. This guy can't go to sleep. Goes to sleep. He sees that image of him.
I can't imagine.
Perfectly justified what he did. Well, he could hardly talk about it one time.
let alone over and over.
Over and over and over. And so about half won't even try. And of the people who do try, roughly half, I'm being broad here,
Sure.
will drop out.
Yeah.
The remainder, it works.
Yeah.
I mean, it'll after 6 months,
But you're only solving the problem for a small percentage of the people,
a small percentage of the people who can tolerate doing it at all.
which are probably not the ones that need it the most.
Probably not. I mean, there's not much study about why somebody can do PTSD, prolonged exposure therapy, and that includes eye movement, rapid desensitization. All of those are all prolonged exposure therapy things. A lot of vets live in rural areas where there's no psychology available at all, and there's some question about whether telemedicine would solve at least that access problem. We don't know the answer to that yet, but that technique works, but it doesn't work for enough people, and it doesn't work quickly enough. It's pretty expensive, actually, to do 6 months of therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you allow me to make a connection for you to a group that's housed out of Springfield? It's called the Warrior's Journey.
Absolutely. We think the way. No, I'm not familiar with a fair number of these affinity groups, but there are a lot of there's Together We Serve, there's Rally Point, there's a lot of places that are interested in trying to help vets who've got a difficulty. VA does a super job.
They do.
But they're all prolonged exposure therapy if they're not giving you selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, a really, really, really bad drug. Yeah, okay, it'll keep you from committing suicide today, but the long-term effect of an SSRI is terrible.
No, it's not good. Well, this organization specializes in
The Warrior's Journey?
the Warrior's Journey. Yeah, they specialize in catching people on the ledge. So when they're suicidal, when they're ready to throw in the towel, when they're literally in, so they kind of own the space online when people search for how to get
Where do I get help for suicide?
or things like that. And by the grace of God, so far, they have been fortunate to have a 100% success rate.
Once they can get a hold of people, right?
Well, once people reach out. And so they have a 24-hour hotline, they have chat online, they have all these. But the cool thing is once they get them into their network, they pair them with people who have gone through whatever they've gone through. So they give them a life coach. It's not just
Sure.
It's not just a therapist.
If there's wonderful organizations, this one sounds like one.
Yeah.
What we would love to be able to have for them is to say, and oh, by the way, once we've talked you off of the bridge, we've got something that can help you.
That's it. That's why I wanted them to connect with you, because they have a lot of PTSD individuals inside, men and women who are heroes that need the help and they don't know where to go. And the Warrior's Journey is trying to become a hub that connects the right people with
They're just the right people for when we have this device ready, which is another year and a half.
Okay.
We'd love to be able to find the way to get it in the hands of the people who need it.
Yeah.
Working with the VA does a great job, but they're very difficult to work with.
Yeah.
They understand bureaucracy and have refined it. They're not your average, ordinary, run-of-the-mill, boring and irritating bureaucracy. They're far better than that. They make the IRS look like powder puffs in terms of trying to deal with them, but they do good work.
They do, and they have a purpose and a great mission, but they need this too. They can't move fast enough to deal with all these challenges.
So there's a device that they're using that basically they give it to the people. And we've talked to these people who've used this device, and they say, well, it's not bad, but it didn't solve the problem. So they don't have anything to solve the problem except prolonged exposure therapy and SSRIs. That's all anybody has.
Nothing that.
No. There's a group that makes a watch, an Apple Watch, that will wake you up if you're having a nightmare. So that's like good news if nightmares is the particular thing that's bothering you the most. I mean, if you don't mind being waked up.
Multiple times in the evening.
Yeah, and you got to buy a new Apple Watch and a new iPhone to go with it. It works.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a good device.
Yeah.
There's another device that is paced breathing. So one way you can invoke the parasympathetic nervous system and the vagus nerve is by breathing. So this is what meditation is doing.
Yes.
Take the deep breaths and so forth. That's actually summoning your parasympathetic nervous system. That works too. But paced breathing, it's hard to get people to do it. They don't see any results from it right away. I mean, there isn't an ideal solution. I think we've got it.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations for that. That's absolutely inspiring.
There are people who need it,
Yeah.
and we can give it to them. But it has to go through FDA testing, and so we think it'll work.
Yeah.
It should work.
So tell us about that.
Okay, the FDA.
Yeah.
So
How bad is that deal?
the thing about the FDA that we all tend to forget is that their job is to make sure things are safe and effective. And they do that. In order to do that, they raise a group of hurdles that you have to go over. Well, of course, right? Because if you're going to make it safe and effective, you can't just come in and say, well, it works, okay? You know, you're going to stamp okay on it. So they have these requirements that you have to go through, and in general, these requirements are reasonable. In combination, there's a lot of them. All right, so you want the device. So take this device. Well, we'd like to be sure that when you put it in your ear, it doesn't like burn your ear or fry your brain.
Right.
So it has to pass safety tests. Well, okay. To pass the safety tests for a device like this, there's an international standard called IEC 60601. It costs between $12,000 and $15,000 to get those tests run. If your device doesn't pass that test, then you got to go back and redesign whatever it is that you're doing so that it does pass the test. There's no point in going to the FDA until you have a device that you can, an electronic device that you can demonstrate is safe.
Right.
Pharmaceutical, it's even worse. It takes longer. You have to do more.
Right.
But with a medical device, particularly this one, the likelihood that it will injure you is very, very small. There's no evidence that you can overdose on electrical stimulation of the vagus nerve. This doesn't appear to be
Anything.
No.
That's great.
I mean, you wouldn't want to be invoking your parasympathetic nervous system if, for example, you were on patrol. That wouldn't be so good. But in general, it's not going to do you any harm.
Right.
It can't do you any harm. You ran it 24 hours a day. At these parameters, it won't do any harm. But they still want to be sure it's not going to burn your ear, or there's not going to be ear irritation, not going to give you tinnitus or headaches or temporal mandible disease or anything like that. So you got to do that.
Right.
And they also will want you to be able to demonstrate that it's effective. So it'll do what you say it'll do.
Mm-hmm.
And you got to come up with the clinical trial that'll demonstrate that. And that in itself can take several months of discussion with the FDA before they're satisfied that you've got a trial that they think that if you hit the endpoints you've said will demonstrate it's effective at some level.
And how big does that? How many?
It'll have to be?
Yeah.
Well, I hate to say this, it depends.
Yeah. No. That.
Yeah. So let's say the end point. So it'll be dependent on what the end point of your trial. So you're going to say, I'm going to do this trial, and here's the endpoints I'm aiming for.
Mm-hmm.
Well, pick those endpoints with care, because they're going to determine how many people you need and how long you have to do it. So if, for example, you want to say that the end point is a reduction in your PTSD score of 12 points, let's say that's your end point. Well, first the FDA says, well, prove to us that that's clinically meaningful. Okay, so now you bring in all the statistics that says 12 points is clinically meaningful, 6 wouldn't be. Over 12 is great.
Yeah.
And then prove to us that lowering the PTSD score is a good thing, right? So I've lowered the score, but if your life still sucks, great, you have a lower score now.
Yeah.
So your PTSD disability will disappear, but you're not any happier than you were before. So you probably are going to have to demonstrate an improvement in the quality of life, a person's quality of life.
They can function in society at a higher level.
At a higher level. They go, their ability to perform in a community is now not impaired. I mean, they can still be a jerk.
Yeah.
They can still be impaired, but it's not impaired by
PTSD.
the PTSD. And then you go to them with a statistical package that says, if I do 60 people and 50% of them hit these endpoints, you'll agree that it's effective. And you'll negotiate with them, and you'll end up with, okay, 65% have to reach these endpoints, and then we'll agree you pass the effectiveness route. And it also depends on just what the indication for use. They call it the IFU. And in classic FDA words, that also means instructions for use, and you have to be careful when you're talking to the FDA about the IFU, that they know which IFU you're talking about. So the instructions for use have got to be able, the indication for use is related to what the effectiveness is going to be. So if you're going to say, this is a standalone treatment, you don't need a psychologist, you don't need to get medicine, you don't need to be under the care of a healthcare professional, they'll make you go through a much bigger, longer trial. If what you're saying is it's an adjunct, so you're going to be under the care of a healthcare professional, and you only have to get better, you don't have to be cured, then it's a much smaller trial. That's why it depends. So, and in many ways, it's like constructing the garage to fit the car instead of buying the car that fits in the garage.
Right. Yeah, totally understand. That's fantastic. Well, Weaver, you've been more than gracious with your time. I can't tell you enough how much I've enjoyed our conversation, and I want to raise a glass with you.
And so here's to what you guys are doing, because
thank you.
The heartbeat of this country is small business.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, and cheers to you for owning your journey.
Okay. Thanks for the interview, and do put us in touch with Warrior's Journey, because
we will.
We hope we'll be able to help.
Yeah.
All right. And here's to you guys. Thanks for coming.